In the crowded city square, an older man with silver in his beard stood quietly on the sidelines, seemingly just another bystander in the chaos of a protest. What looked like a civilian standoff turned deadly when an ambitious police officer stepped forward, taser in hand, determined to assert control. Chuck Norris wasn't your typical concerned onlooker. For decades, he had been a martial arts icon, a black belt in karate, and a man whose name had become synonymous with discipline and strength. Known for withstanding punishment that would break others, his legend was built on mastery of body and mind. When Officer Briggs leveled his taser and fired, he had no idea he was testing a man trained to endure far worse. Chuck's calm defiance and strategic response, standing through the crackling current, then disarming his attacker without escalation, triggered a chain of consequences that spread across the city and beyond. What began as a routine show of force would become a defining clash between arrogance and mastery. The city square, once divided by protest lines, would never be the same after witnessing the night a police officer tried to take down Chuck Norris and discovered too late who he was facing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The city square pulsed with tension, a living organism of shouting voices and flashing lights. Protesters surged against metal barricades, while blue and red police lights painted everyone in alternating hues of urgency. Signs bobbed above the crowd like rectangular buoys in a human sea. Justice now. Power to the people. We won't be silenced. The fall air carried a sharp bite, amplifying the electricity of confrontation. Standing at the edge of this chaos, Chuck Norris watched. Not with judgment or fear, but with the quiet assessment of someone who had seen conflict in all its forms. His weathered face, framed by that signature beard now streaked with dignified silver, remained impassive. He wore simple clothes, a worn leather jacket over a plain button-down shirt, jeans, and boots that had traveled far more miles than most people ever would. Nothing about him demanded attention, and in a crowd focused on making noise, his stillness rendered him nearly invisible. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step back," a young officer barked at nearby onlookers, his voice strained to project authority over the chance. Chuck simply nodded and shifted slightly, maintaining his position without confrontation. That was his way now to observe, to understand, to exist in spaces without claiming them. The years had tempered whatever need for spotlight he might once have had. He'd come tonight not as an activist or counter-protester, but as a citizen concerned about the growing divisions in his city. Across the square, Maya Chen adjusted her camera, capturing the perfect angle of protesters facing the police line. At 28, she carried herself with the focused intensity of someone determined to rise above the blur of social media journalism. Her press credentials hung around her neck, a shield and a license to bear witness. "We're live in 3, her cameraman counted down. Maya straightened her blazer and transformed, her voice sliding into the practiced cadence of broadcast journalism. "I'm here downtown, where what started as a peaceful demonstration has evolved into a tense standoff between protesters and police. The air is thick with..." A sudden surge in the crowd knocked her sideways. The camera jerked. "Watch it!" A teenage boy snapped, steadying himself against her. "Sorry," Maya recovered quickly, recognizing him as one of the more vocal protesters from earlier footage. "Ethan, right? You were leading chants earlier." The teenager, lanky with defiant eyes beneath a mop of dark hair, seemed surprised to be recognized. "Yeah. You actually know my name?" "I pay attention," she said, already calculating how to use this encounter in her coverage. "What brings you out tonight?" "Same as everyone," Ethan gestured broadly. "They don't listen unless we make noise." His eyes drifted to Chuck, standing quietly nearby. unlike some people who just watch. What's the point of being here if you're not going to do something? Chuck heard but didn't react. The boy's judgment slid off him like rain on stone. 50 yards away, Officer Briggs tightened his grip on his riot shield, scanning the crowd for any excuse to assert control. At 34, his record showed a pattern. Quick to escalate. Slow to de-escalate. The department had promoted him anyway. Results mattered more than methods to his superiors, and Briggs got results. "Crowd's getting rowdy," he remarked to his superior, Sergeant Alvarez, a veteran officer whose salt and pepper hair matched the steadiness of his gaze. "They're just exercising their rights," Alvarez replied evenly. "Our job is to keep everyone safe, not to escalate." Briggs scoffed. "Respect needs to be established early. These people only understand a show of force." "Force isn't the same as power, Briggs," Alvarez said. His eyes suddenly fixed on a point across the square. He squinted, then straightened slightly. "Is that?" "What?" Briggs followed his gaze toward Chuck. "Nothing," Alvarez said too quickly. "Just keep it professional tonight." Briggs bristled at what felt like unnecessary instruction. He'd been doing this job for 12 years. He knew how to handle civilians. His hand unconsciously touched the taser at his belt, a reassuring weight of authority. The protests swelled as more people joined, their collective voice growing louder. Signs waved higher. Camera flashes became more frequent, and the police line tightened in response. Chuck remained where he was, an island of stillness in a sea of motion, watching not with detachment, but with the focus of someone who understood that sometimes the most important action was careful observation. Maya's cameraman signaled her again. "We're getting reports of movement at the north barricade." She nodded. "Let's go." As they navigated through the crowd, she noticed Ethan trailing them, phone held high to capture his own footage. She also noticed Chuck, still in the same spot, and wondered briefly about his story. There was something about him, a presence that seemed both ordinary and somehow significant. A potential human interest angle, perhaps for later. What none of them realized was how their paths would converge in the next hour, how a single moment of arrogance would collide with decades of quiet discipline, creating an incident that would echo far beyond this city square on this cold autumn night. The protesters began a new chant, their voices rising in unison, drowning out individual thoughts. "Woo's streets! Our streets!" The words bounced between buildings, amplifying until they seemed to shake the very air. Chuck watched as Officer Briggs detached from the police line, moving with deliberate purpose toward a group of louder protesters. Sergeant Alvarez called something after him, but Briggs either didn't hear or chose to ignore it. The first confrontation was beginning, and with it, the invisible threads connecting everyone in the square pulled tighter. Midnight passed, but the protest showed no signs of dispersing. If anything, the darkness gave it new energy, as if the absence of daylight permitted greater expression of collective anger. News vans lined the perimeter, their satellite dishes extending toward the sky like mechanical flowers seeking light. Officer Briggs moved through the crowd with practiced intimidation, his hand resting obviously on his belt equipment, his posture designed to project unquestionable authority. Each interaction followed the same pattern. Approach. Tower over. Issue commands rather than requests. Most people stepped back. Those who didn't received additional attention. "Keep moving," he ordered a small group of protesters who had paused to rest. "No loitering. We have a right to be here," one woman challenged, though she shifted her weight nervously. "You have a right to peaceful assembly, not to block public access," Briggs countered, stepping closer until she retreated. Each small victory fed something in him. In a chaotic situation, he was the force that created order. People responded to his commands. They moved, when he told them to move. His authority wasn't just a badge and uniform, it was the certainty he projected, the consequences implied in his stance and tone. From across the square, Sergeant Alvarez watched with growing concern. He keyed his radio. "Briggs, return to the line. You're too far out." Briggs pretended not to hear, switching his radio to a different channel. He'd been tasked with maintaining control, and that's exactly what he intended to do. His patrol brought him eventually to the area where Chuck stood, still quietly observing. Something about the older man's calm demeanor registered as defiance to Briggs. Everyone else reacted to his presence, stepped aside, lowered their eyes, or became defensively loud. This man did none of those things. He simply stood, watching, as if Briggs were any other person in the crowd. "You need to move along," Briggs said, using the same authoritative tone that had worked on others. Chuck turned to him with unhurried attention. "I'm not blocking anything, officer." The calm response only irritated Briggs further. He stepped closer, using his height advantage. "This area is being cleared. Move back behind the yellow markers." Chuck looked to where Briggs pointed a line at least 50 yards back, well away from any meaningful observation of the protest. His eyes, sharp beneath the weight of experience, returned to Briggs's face. "I believe I have the right to observe from this public sidewalk," he said. His voice neither confrontational nor submissive, simply matter-of-fact. Maya Chen, returning from filming at the North Barricade, caught the interaction in her peripheral vision. Something about the dynamic made her redirect her cameraman. "Over there," she said quietly. "Something's happening." Briggs felt a flush of anger rise from his collar. The man's calm refusal was worse than outright defiance. It was a questioning of his judgment, his authority. Briggs said, his voice rising. "Move back now, or face consequences." People nearby began to notice the confrontation. Phones appeared. Recording. Ethan pushed forward, capturing everything. His expression caught between excitement at potential drama and reflexive distrust of police authority. "What's he done wrong?" Someone in the gathering crowd called out. "Mind your business." Briggs snapped back, without looking away from Chuck. Sergeant Alvarez noticed the cluster forming and moved quickly in that direction, already sensing trouble. "Briggs," he called, "stand down." But Briggs was locked in now, committed to a path he couldn't abandon without losing face. The crowd's attention had transformed this into a public test of his authority. Chuck's continued calm in the face of his escalating commands felt like mockery. "I'm going to need to see some ID," Briggs demanded, his hand dropping to his belt where his taser Saturday. "May I ask why?" Chuck's question came without heat or challenge, a simple request for clarification. That reasonable tone pushed Briggs over an edge he hadn't realized was so close. In his mind, compliance should be immediate, not questioned. Authority worked only when it was absolute. "Because I said so," he growled, unclipping his taser. "Hands where I can see them, now." The crowd gasped collectively. Phones lifted higher. Maya's cameraman zoomed in. Chuck slowly raised his hands to shoulder level, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Officer, I don't think this is necessary." "On your knees," Briggs commanded. Taser now drawn and aimed. Sergeant Alvarez pushed through the crowd. "Briggs, stand down immediately." Whether Briggs didn't hear through the rush of blood in his ears or simply couldn't back down now, he took Chuck's momentary hesitation as resistance. Without further warning, he fired the taser. 2 electrified prongs shot out, connecting with Chuck's chest. The crack of electricity cut through the night. The crowd's reaction was immediate shouts of outrage, phones recording frantically, people pushing forward for a better view. What happened next stunned everyone. Briggs, most of all. Chuck flinched as the electrical current surged through him, his body tensed, jaw clenched against the pain, but where most people would have collapsed instantly, he remained standing. His knees buckled slightly, but through what could only be described as extraordinary discipline, he kept his feet. Briggs stared in disbelief, his finger still on the trigger, sending continuous current. "Get on the ground!" he shouted, but his voice had lost its certainty. The taser's effect was real. Chuck's muscles contracted painfully. His breathing became labored, but something deeper than physical strength kept him upright. Decades of martial arts training, of learning to control his body's response to pain, of mental discipline that had become as natural as breathing, all coalesced in this moment of truth. With tremendous effort, Chuck reached up with one shaking hand and gripped the taser wires. Then, with a deliberate movement that defied the electrical current still coursing through him, he pulled the prongs from his chest. The crowd fell silent. Dozens of cameras captured the impossible moment. Even Maya Chen, professional to her core, whispered an awed profanity into her live microphone. Sergeant Alvarez finally reached Briggs and physically pushed his arm down. "That's enough." Briggs stood frozen, taser still in hand, staring at the man who should be on the ground but wasn't. For the first time that night, perhaps for the first time in years, uncertainty crept into his expression. Chuck stood straighter now, freed from the electrical assault. His eyes, previously calm, had taken on a focus that seemed to cut through Briggs like a physical force. He hadn't moved toward the officer, hadn't raised his voice, or his fists. He'd simply endured and overcome. And somehow, that was more intimidating than any threat could have been. The crowd began to whisper, the sound spreading like wind through leaves. "Did you see that?" He just stood there. "Who is this guy?" And then, from somewhere in the back, a voice of recognition. "Wait, is that Chuck Norris?" The name rippled through the crowd, gathering momentum with each repetition. Those old enough to remember looked again with widening eyes. Younger protesters checked their phones, searching images, confirming with growing excitement. Ethan, who had been filming everything, lowered his phone slightly. "Chuck Norris? The martial arts guy? No way." The square seemed to hold its collective breath. The protest, the police line, the original purpose of the gathering all temporarily forgotten in the face of this unexpected development. In the center of it all stood Chuck, still saying nothing, his steady gaze fixed on Officer Briggs, who now clutched his taser with a hand that had begun to tremble slightly. The spark of arrogance had been struck. Now everyone waited to see what flame would follow. The city square had transformed. What began as a protest, divided clearly between demonstrators and police, had reorganized itself around a new focal point. Chuck Norris stood at the center of an impromptu clearing, as people instinctively gave him space while simultaneously pressing forward to witness whatever might happen next. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Officer Briggs remained where he was, taser now lowered but still in hand, his confident posture replaced by something more uncertain. Sergeant Alvarez stood beside him, one hand firmly on Briggs's shoulder. His expression tense, with professional concern and personal recognition. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" Alvarez muttered to Briggs, low enough that only the younger officer could hear. Briggs swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He refused to comply. "That's Chuck Norris, you idiot," Alvarez hissed. The name finally registered fully with Briggs. Not just a random, difficult civilian, but a martial arts legend, a man whose capabilities were so renowned they had spawned an entire category of hyperbolic jokes about invincibility. The realization should have made Briggs retreat. but pride kept him rooted. Backing down now, in front of so many cameras, felt impossible. Chuck reached up with deliberate calm and straightened his jacket, then brushed at the small holes where the taser prongs had penetrated the fabric. His movements were unhurried. Precise, the economy of motion that comes from decades of disciplined training. "Sir," Alvarez said, stepping forward, placing himself partially between Chuck and Briggs, "on behalf of the department, I apologize for this incident." Chuck acknowledged him with a small nod but said nothing. The absence of an outburst, no shouted threats, no demands for badge numbers, no dramatic declarations of lawsuits to come, was somehow more unsettling than any reaction could have been. The crowd had begun to shift allegiance, their collective focus no longer on the original protest, but on this unexpected confrontation. Phones recorded from every angle. Social media was already exploding with partial videos of the tasing, the impossible endurance, the recognition spreading through the crowd. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" The chant started softly, tentatively, from a small group near the back. It spread quickly, growing in volume and conviction, until it seemed to bounce off the surrounding buildings. The cadence was different from the protest chants earlier, less angry, more celebratory, even reverent. Maya Chen sensed the historic potential of the moment unfolding before her. She positioned herself at the edge of the clearing, cameraman capturing everything, her voice taking on the hushed tone reserved for witnessing something truly extraordinary. "What we're seeing right now defies explanation," she narrated quietly. Chuck Norris, martial arts legend and cultural icon, has just withstood a direct taser assault that would have incapacitated anyone else. The crowd, previously focused on their demonstration, has now united around this unexpected development. Ethan pushed his way to the front, phone still recording, his youthful skepticism giving way to undisguised awe. Earlier, he had dismissed Chuck as just another passive observer, someone unwilling to take action. Now, he stared with the dawning realization that true strength might look different than he had assumed. Briggs, desperate to regain control of the situation, raised his voice. "Everyone needs to disperse. This area is being cleared." His words, which an hour earlier might have prompted compliance, now fell flat against the wall of focused attention on Chuck. Several people actively turned their backs on Briggs, dismissing his authority entirely. This visible rejection struck Briggs harder than any physical blow. His authority, the foundation of his identity, the power he had always relied upon, was evaporating before his eyes. Panic fluttered beneath his professional exterior. He moved his hand to his belt, touching his pepper spray, then his baton, searching for some tool that might restore the balance of power. Chuck watched this with the calm assessment of someone who had studied human nature as carefully as he had studied combat. He recognized the dangerous spiral of wounded pride, the desperate need to reassert dominance that could lead Briggs to further poor decisions. With deliberate care, he began to remove his jacket. The simple action captured everyone's attention. Chuck folded the jacket neatly and handed it to a nearby protester, a middle-aged woman who accepted it with visible reverence. He rolled up his sleeves methodically, revealing forearms corded with lean muscle that belied his age. "Sir," Alvarez tried again, genuine concern in his voice, "there's no need for this to escalate further." Chuck finally spoke, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden hush that had fallen over the crowd. "I agree, Sergeant." Those two simple words, delivered without heat or challenge, somehow carried more weight than any threat. This wasn't a man preparing for confrontation. This was a master creating space for de-escalation, offering Briggs a path to retreat with dignity. But Briggs, trapped in his spiral of insecurity and pride, saw only a challenge. "You're interfering with police business," he said, voice rising to carry to the crowd. "I'm placing you under arrest." A collective intake of breath, swept through the onlookers. Phones lifted higher. The chanting stopped as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Chuck stood perfectly still, neither advancing nor retreating, his posture balanced and centered. "I don't think that's necessary, officer." "On your knees," Briggs commanded again, desperation making his voice crack slightly. "Final warning!" Sergeant Alvarez moved to intervene physically. But faster than anyone could track, Briggs had unholstered his baton and extended it with a sharp metallic snap. Time seemed to slow. The crowd surged slightly, their collective tension palpable. Maya's cameraman zoomed in tight, capturing every nuance of the standoff. Ethan lowered his phone, suddenly afraid of what he might witness. In that suspended moment, Chuck made a decision. Not with words, but with presence. He shifted his weight slightly, settling into a stance that would be recognized by anyone familiar with martial arts, not aggressive, but prepared. His hands remained open at his sides, but the subtle change in his posture transformed him. Where before had stood a somewhat unremarkable older man, now the years fell away, revealing the disciplined warrior beneath the unassuming exterior. The transformation wasn't lost on the crowd. A hushed murmur swept through them, a collective recognition of awakened potential. The chant resumed, no longer tentative but certain, reverential. "Chuck! Chuck! Chuck!" Even those too young to have seen his films or matches seemed to recognize intuitively what they were witnessing. Not celebrity, but genuine mastery. The real thing standing before them in an age of imitations. Briggs felt the shift in the atmosphere like a physical pressure. The ground beneath his feet no longer felt solid. The badge and uniform that had always granted him automatic respect now seemed insufficient against the quiet dignity radiating from the man before him. "I'm warning you," Briggs said. But the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. Chuck's eyes never left Briggs's face, not with anger or challenge, but with a steady assessment that seemed to see through the uniform to the insecurity beneath. When he finally spoke again, his voice was almost gentle. "I understand you're doing your job, officer, but right now, you have a choice about how this ends." The words hung in the air between them, not a threat, but an observation, an invitation to find a better path. For a brief moment, something in Briggs seemed to waver. A flicker of recognition that he had overstepped, that retreat might be the wiser course. Then his radio crackled with a supervisor demanding an update, and the hesitation vanished beneath renewed determination. Too many people were watching. Too much was at stake. He couldn't back down now. Briggs tightened his grip on the baton and stepped forward. Briggs lunged forward, baton arcing through the air with practiced precision. The blow that would have struck most civilians never landed. Chuck's movement was so fluid, so perfectly timed, that it appeared almost casual. A simple shift of weight, a slight turn of the body, and the baton whistled harmlessly past. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Maya Chen's voice caught mid-sentence in her live narration. Sergeant Alvarez stopped his advance. Recognition in his eyes, he knew what he was witnessing. And intervention now might only make things worse. Time seemed to dilate in that moment. For Chuck, the world had narrowed to this single interaction. Not a fight, not even a confrontation, but a problem to be solved with minimal harm. His awareness expanded to encompass everything. Briggs's labored breathing, the subtle shifts in the officer's weight distribution, telegraphing his intentions, the crowd's collective intake of breath, the phones raised to capture every moment. Decades of training had made this heightened perception automatic. He didn't need to think about how to respond. His body simply knew. Briggs stumbled slightly from the momentum of his missed strike, his balance compromised by the force he had committed to a blow that met only air. Disbelief flashed across his face, quickly replaced by determination. He corrected his stance with practiced recovery, feet shifting to regain stability, and swung again, a horizontal strike aimed at Chuck's midsection. More controlled this time. Less telegraphed. This time, Chuck didn't just evade. His hand moved with precision born from tens of thousands of hours of practice, catching Briggs's wrist at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right pressure, enough to stop the strike, but not enough to cause injury. His fingers found pressure points that momentarily weakened Briggs's grip. The baton clattered to the ground. The sound of it hitting the pavement seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed square. A metallic punctuation mark in the tense narrative, unfolding before dozens of cameras. "Stand down, officer," Chuck said quietly. His voice measured and calm despite the adrenaline that must have been coursing through him. "No one needs to get hurt here." Briggs stared at his empty hand, then at the baton on the ground, his face flushing deep red from his collar upward. The public disarmament was more than a tactical defeat. It was a humiliation witnessed by hundreds of present observers and soon to be seen by millions online. Training and procedure disappeared beneath a wave of raw emotion. With a wordless shout that seemed torn from somewhere primal, he charged forward, attempting to tackle Chuck to the ground. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion for those watching. Chuck sidestepped with minimal movement, no wasted energy, no dramatic evasion. His hands found precise pressure points on Briggs's extended arms, not striking but redirecting. Not opposing force but channeling it. A subtle shift of balance, a redirection rather than opposition of force, and Briggs's momentum carried him past Chuck and down to one knee. The maneuver wasn't flashy. It contained none of the dramatic kicks or spins that had characterized Chuck's film career. This was something more fundamental, the essence of martial arts, stripped to its core principles. Balance. Timing. Efficiency. Many in the crowd didn't even fully register what had happened. Only that Chuck remained standing while Briggs was suddenly kneeling. Chuck immediately stepped back, hands open, clearly indicating he had no desire to continue the confrontation. He said, loud enough for nearby cameras to capture, "Let's all take a breath." The restraint was as impressive as the skill. He could have countered more aggressively, could have used Briggs's momentum to throw him completely or strike while he was vulnerable. Instead, he had chosen the minimum necessary response, a demonstration rather than a defeat, a lesson rather than a punishment. In that moment, some in the crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. This wasn't celebrity showing off. It was mastery expressing itself in its purest form. The difference between someone who played at fighting for entertainment and someone who had integrated its principles into their very being. But Briggs was beyond rational calculation now. Scrambling back to his feet, face contorted with humiliation and rage, he reached for his pepper spray. "You're assaulting an officer!" he shouted, the words ringing hollow even as he spoke them, transparently false to everyone watching. Sergeant Alvarez finally moved decisively, pushing through the small clearing that had formed around the confrontation. He grabbed Briggs's arm just as the officer's fingers closed around the pepper spray canister. "Officer Briggs! Stand down immediately! That's an order!" Briggs hesitated, caught between rage and the lifetime of conditioning to obey superior officers. The conflict played across his face, the animal part of his brain demanding retaliation, the professional part dimly recognizing the career-ending precipice before him. In that moment of indecision, several other police officers pushed through the crowd, responding to Alvarez's earlier radio calls for backup. "What's the situation?" the first officer asked. A younger man, with a wary expression, taking in the scene with professional caution. Officer Briggs used excessive force on a civilian observer, Alvarez said firmly, authority resonating in every syllable. I'm ordering him to stand down. The new arrivals assessed quickly, the angry officer, the calm civilian, the crowd recording everything, the discarded taser wires and baton on the ground. One of them, older than the others, clearly recognized Chuck and whispered something to his colleagues. Their postures shifted subtly. Wariness, giving way to something like respect. The thin blue line, strong as it was, had its limits. What Briggs had done and what had been captured so thoroughly on camera had crossed them. "Briggs! Step back!" one of them said, moving to separate him from Chuck. But Briggs shook off Alvarez's restraining hand, the last threads of his professional judgment fraying completely. He resisted lawful commands. His voice had taken on a desperate edge, higher pitched than before, almost pleading for someone to validate his version of events, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Everything was slipping away: his authority, his control of the situation, perhaps even his career, if the videos spreading across social media right now were as damning as he feared. In this moment of escalating tension, Chuck demonstrated perhaps the most profound skill of all: perfect stillness. He remained where he was, centered and calm amidst the chaos, neither advancing nor retreating. His breathing remained steady, his posture balanced. His eyes stayed on Briggs, not with animosity but with alert awareness of the danger a cornered, humiliated man might still pose. He had not come here seeking confrontation, but neither would he leave a volatile situation unresolved. The crowd had grown larger as words spread through the protest about what was happening. People who had been focused on their own chants and signs now pressed forward, drawn by the magnetic pull of authentic drama. The chanting had stopped, replaced by a tense silence, broken only by the clicks of phone cameras and hurried whispers. Everyone sensed they were witnessing something significant, not just a confrontation, but a moment that revealed deeper truths about power, restraint, and genuine authority. Maya Chen continued her narration, her professional demeanor barely containing her own astonishment. "What we're seeing is extraordinary," she said, voice low but intense. Chuck Norris, faced with aggression, has demonstrated the precise control and restraint that made him a martial arts legend. He's choosing minimal force even when provoked. Her cameraman zoomed in on Chuck's face, capturing the focused calm in his eyes, not the vacant stare of someone disconnected from the situation, but the present awareness of someone fully engaged yet perfectly centered. Ethan had lowered his phone, no longer recording, but simply watching with undisguised awe. The cynicism that had armored him through adolescence cracked in the face of authentic mastery. He had come to the protest believing that power came from volume, from disruption, from forcing others to acknowledge you. Now he witnessed a different kind of strength, one that didn't need to announce itself to be recognized, one that commanded respect without demanding it. "Holy shit," he whispered to no one in particular. "That's the real deal." Briggs made one final, desperate attempt to salvage the situation, or perhaps simply to save face, to avoid the complete collapse of the identity he had built around his badge and uniform. "All of you, back up now," he shouted at the crowd, pepper spray still in hand, voice cracking with strain. "This is an active situation!" No one moved. Not a single person took a step back. The collective decision to stay, to witness, to record, was itself a kind of power, the power of accountability, of bearing witness. Every phone was a statement that what happened here would not be hidden or denied later, would not be reduced to contradicting verbal accounts or dismissed as exaggeration. Something in Briggs finally broke. With a guttural sound of frustration that was almost a sob, he aimed the pepper spray directly at Chuck's face and pressed the trigger. The caustic stream shot forward, but never reached its target. Chuck's hand moved with almost impossible speed, deflecting Briggs's wrist upward so the spray discharged harmlessly into the air. Simultaneously, his other hand executed a precise strike to Briggs's forearm, targeting a nerve cluster that caused his fingers to involuntarily release the canister. The pepper spray clattered to the ground beside the discarded baton, the sound emphasizing the officer's progressive disarmament, first the electrical weapon, then the impact weapon, now the chemical weapon. Each escalation had been met with the same composed efficiency. Each threat neutralized with the minimum necessary force. This time, the crowd's reaction was audible, a collective gasp, followed by scattered applause and renewed chants of Chuck's name. The speed and precision of the defense seemed to confirm for everyone that they were indeed witnessing something beyond ordinary human capability. Not superhuman in the literal sense, but the upper limits of what dedicated human discipline and training could achieve. Chuck! 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 The chant spread rapidly. No longer tentative, but full-throated. Reverential. People who had been recording lowered their phones momentarily to join in, though most quickly raised them again, unwilling to miss a moment of what was unfolding. The new officers moved in quickly now, two of them restraining Briggs, who had finally run out of weapons and will to fight. His shoulders slumped visibly as the reality of what he had done and what had been captured on dozens of cameras began to sink in. The manufactured confidence that had carried him through years of bullying disguised as authority drained away, leaving behind the insecure man who had always hidden beneath the uniform. "You're relieved, Briggs," Alvarez said firmly. "Report back to the station immediately." There was no need to add, "and surrender your badge and gun." That part was implicit, understood by everyone present. Some lines, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. Some actions, once captured with such thorough documentation, could not be explained away. As the officers led Briggs away, the crowd parted silently, their earlier antagonism toward police temporarily suspended in the face of this more specific justice. Many continued filming, ensuring that Briggs's departure was as thoroughly documented as his actions had been. There was a solemnity to the moment, not celebration of his downfall, but acknowledgement that accountability, when it came, was worthy of witness. Chuck remained where he stood, his breathing calm, his posture still balanced and ready. Though the immediate threat had passed, decades of training kept him prepared for any possibility. He scanned the crowd briefly, assessing that the situation was stabilizing rather than escalating further. Only when Briggs had been fully removed from the scene did Chuck allow himself a slight relaxation of his guard, his stance softening almost imperceptibly. Sergeant Alvarez approached him with visible respect, not the cautious deference shown to celebrities but the genuine recognition one professional offers another. "Mr. Norris, I can't apologize enough for Officer Briggs's actions. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, I'll personally ensure it's processed properly." Chuck considered this for a moment, then shook his head slightly. "I think there's been enough documentation tonight, Sergeant. What happens next is between Officer Briggs and your department." The response, measured, without vindictiveness or a desire for further punishment, seemed to impress Alvarez even more than the physical skills Chuck had demonstrated. He nodded with genuine respect. "Thank you, sir." What Alvarez recognized, and what many in the crowd were beginning to understand, was that Chuck's restraint hadn't been merely physical. It extended to every aspect of his response. He had defended without attacking, neutralized without humiliating, established boundaries without seeking retribution. Even now, with every right to demand consequences, he chose instead to trust the system to function as it should. The crowd began to shift and murmur as the immediate drama concluded. But no one left. If anything, more people pressed forward. Phones extended, hoping to capture something, a word, a gesture, any acknowledgement from the legend who had suddenly appeared in their midst. Chuck noticed a young man at the front of the crowd, Ethan, who had mocked him earlier for his passivity. Their eyes met briefly across the space that had become both physical and symbolic, the distance between judgment and understanding, between youth and experience, between appearance and reality. Chuck gave him a small nod, acknowledging something only they understood. A lesson delivered without words about different forms of strength, about the gap between showing and telling. Ethan nodded back, his expression transformed by genuine respect. In that silent exchange, past wisdom that would have been diminished by verbalization, about how true power often lies in restraint, about how strength is proven not in domination, but in discipline. Maya Chen approached cautiously, her cameraman a few steps behind. "Mr. Norris, would you be willing to comment on what just happened?" Chuck looked at her, taking in the professional composure that barely contained her excitement at the potential exclusive. He recognized in her something genuine, not just ambition, but a desire to understand and communicate truth. Before he could respond, shouts erupted from the far side of the square, the original protest, finding new energy, new confrontations forming between demonstrators and police. The moment of unified focus was breaking. Reality was reasserting itself, the larger conflicts that had brought everyone here in the first place, rushing back into the foreground. The brief interlude of witnessing something extraordinary gave way to the ongoing struggle that had defined the night before Chuck's involvement. Chuck turned toward the renewed commotion, his expression thoughtful. The path ahead was complicated in ways that physical confrontation was not. Briggs had been just one man, acting out of personal insecurity and misplaced aggression. The larger tensions in the square, between police and protesters, between different visions of justice and order, were not so easily resolved with a precise strike or perfectly timed sidestep. For the first time that night, Chuck moved with purpose toward the center of the conflict, rather than remaining on its edges. Not with the intention of taking sides, but with the recognition that sometimes presence itself could be a form of intervention, that the same principles that had guided his response to Briggs might offer something to the larger confrontation unfolding across the square. Behind him, phones tracked his movement. Cameras followed his trajectory. Voices murmured in anticipation. The legend had awakened fully now, not through dramatic declaration or showy technique, but through the quiet authority that comes from perfect alignment of principle and action. Whatever happened next would be witnessed not just by those physically present but by millions who would later see the footage, a responsibility Chuck accepted with the same calm focus he brought to everything. The crowd parted before him as he walked, creating a path not out of fear but respect, the instinctive deference shown to authentic mastery. Chuck moved toward the new center of tension, carrying with him not just decades of physical training, but the wisdom that came from understanding that true power lay not in domination, but in transformation. The far side of the square had erupted into fresh chaos. What exactly triggered? It remained unclear whether a protester crossed a line, an officer pushed too hard, or simply the collective tension, finding a new focal point after Chuck's confrontation with Briggs concluded. Regardless of cause, the result was unmistakable. The fragile equilibrium had shattered. Protesters surged against the police line, their earlier chants transforming into raw, angry shouts. Signs that had been held aloft now became potential weapons, wooden handles raised like spears. Officers locked shields, forming a wall of plastic and purpose, batons raised defensively as they braced for impact. The situation teetered on the edge of something much worse than the controlled opposition of earlier hours. The invisible line between protest and riot, between expression and violence, was fraying with each passing second. Chuck moved toward this new center of conflict with deliberate calm, his pace unhurried yet purposeful. To the casual observer, he might have appeared to be simply walking, but martial artists in the crowd would have recognized the subtle readiness in his gait weight. Perfectly centered. Balance maintained with each step. The economy of movement that came from decades of practice. He moved like someone who had learned that rushing rarely improved outcomes, that panic was the enemy of precision. People instinctively made way for him, creating a path through the densely packed crowd. Some reached out briefly to touch his shoulder or arm as he passed, as if contact might transfer some portion of the extraordinary composure he embodied. Others whispered his name in tones that ranged from awe to disbelief. For many of the younger protesters, Chuck Norris had been more meme than man, until tonight a collection of hyperbolic jokes about invincibility rather than a flesh-and-blood person with actual skills. Now reality and legend converged before their eyes. Maya Chen and her cameraman followed, recognizing that the story had shifted again. Chuck Norris is now moving toward the renewed confrontation, she narrated as they walked, maintaining professional composure despite the electricity of the moment. After diffusing one volatile situation, he appears to be intervening in another. Her cameraman kept the focus tight on Chuck's back as he moved through the crowd, capturing the almost surreal calm he maintained amidst the growing chaos. The contrast was visually striking all around him. Faces were contorted with emotion, bodies tense with anticipation of conflict, voices raised in anger or fear. Yet Chuck moved through it all like still water through rapids. His presence a counterpoint to the tumult. Sergeant Alvarez noticed Chuck's trajectory and moved quickly to intercept him, pushing against the flow of bodies with urgent purpose. "Mr. Norris," he called, finally reaching him, concern evident in his voice. "I have to advise against getting involved. This situation is escalating quickly." Chuck paused, acknowledging Alvarez's concern with a slight nod. His eyes, sharp beneath years of laugh lines and weathered skin, met the sergeant's with calm recognition of the risks. "I understand your concern, Sergeant, but sometimes presence matters more than action." The simple statement carried weight beyond its words, an acknowledgement between two professionals, one in uniform and one not, that authority came in different forms. Alvarez hesitated, torn between protocol and the recognition that conventional approaches weren't working. Before he could respond, a glass bottle shattered against a nearby wall, thrown by someone in the crowd. Though in the chaos, it was impossible to identify who. The sound was like a starting pistol, triggering simultaneous surges from both sides. Protesters pushed forward with renewed determination. Police raised batons higher, their defensive posture shifting subtly toward offensive readiness. The moment of violent contact seemed inevitable. Chuck resumed his advance, now moving more quickly but still without apparent urgency. Each step was measured, deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning the unfolding situation. He positioned himself precisely at the friction point where protesters met police, turning so that he faced the crowd rather than the officers. The positioning was deliberate, a physical statement that he was not confronting law enforcement but addressing the citizens. It placed him in the most vulnerable position possible, his back to armed officers, facing the unpredictable energy of the crowd. Yet, there was no hesitation in his movements, no evidence of fear in his posture. The protesters nearest him faltered, momentum broken by his unexpected presence. Those behind continued pushing forward for a moment before awareness spread that something had changed. Like a wave hitting an immovable object, the forward motion dissipated into confusion, into questions rippling backward through the press of bodies. "What's happening? Who's up there? Is that?" Chuck raised his hands slightly, not in surrender, but in a universal gesture for pause, for attention. The movement was smooth, non-threatening, yet somehow commanding. He said nothing, allowing his presence to speak first, understanding the power of silence in a space filled with noise. The police line behind him held position, officers uncertain how to respond to this civilian who had placed himself between them and the protesters. Some recognized him immediately. Others knew only that something unexpected was happening. Sergeant Alvarez quickly moved along the line, issuing quiet orders to hold steady, to wait, to see. For a long moment, the square hung in perfect tension. Protesters paused mid-surge, police frozen in defensive posture, and Chuck Norris standing calmly at the center of it all, hands slightly raised, face composed. The only sounds were the distant wail of sirens, the rustle of nervous movement, the click of cameras capturing this extraordinary tableau. Then he spoke. His voice pitched to carry without shouting. The tone conversational, yet somehow cutting through the ambient noise with perfect clarity. Everyone take a breath. The simple instruction, delivered with such quiet authority, had an almost hypnotic effect. People who seconds earlier had been shouting found themselves inhaling deeply. The autonomous response to a command issued with absolute confidence. The collective breath seemed to release some of the pressure that had built in the square, creating space for what came next. "I'm not here to take sides," Chuck continued, addressing the protesters directly, but loudly enough for police to hear clearly. "I'm here as a citizen concerned about what happens next. What we do in the next few minutes will be remembered long after the specific issues that brought us here have been resolved." His words carried no bombast, no dramatic flair, just the measured cadence of someone speaking truth as they understood it. There was something almost old-fashioned in his approach, a plain-spoken directness that cut through the cynicism many had brought to the square. A young protester near the front called out, voice raw with emotion, "They don't listen unless we make them. You saw what that cop did to you." Chuck nodded, acknowledging the point without dismissing it. "I did. And you saw what happened as a result. One man's poor judgment, captured on dozens of cameras. Accountability without escalation." The words landed heavily in the square. Many protesters glanced at their phones, which had just captured extraordinary evidence of both injustice and consequence. The power of witness, not violence. "But that was you," another voice called out. This one belonging to a woman in her 30s. Frustration evident in her tense posture. "You're Chuck Norris. We're just regular people." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. It was a legitimate challenge. What had happened with Briggs seemed possible only because of Chuck's exceptional skills, his celebrity status, his larger-than-life reputation. What relevance did his experience have for ordinary citizens facing systemic issues? Chuck's response was measured, thoughtful. "I'm just a citizen," he replied, his tone neither defensive nor condescending. "What happened earlier wasn't about who I am. It was about remaining calm under pressure, about not letting someone else's poor judgment dictate your response." He turned slightly, including both protesters and police in his address, his gaze sweeping across the human landscape before him. Aggression feeds aggression. Escalation invites escalation. We all have a choice about what energy we contribute to this moment. The square grew quieter as more people strained to hear, curiosity temporarily overriding anger. Even those who had been at the edges of confrontation moments earlier now paused, attention drawn to this unexpected voice of measured calm amid chaos. Maya Chen's cameraman zoomed in tight on Chuck's face as he continued speaking, his words reaching not just those physically present, but the growing online audience watching the live stream. His expression was earnest without being naive, his eyes clear and direct. "I've spent my life studying conflict," Chuck said, his voice carrying easily in the attentive silence that had fallen. "The most important lesson I've learned is that true strength lies in restraint, in choosing when not to strike even when you can. The words carried particular weight coming from him, a man whose career had been built on the carefully choreographed illusion of violence, but whose actual martial philosophy had always emphasized discipline over aggression, control over chaos. He gestured toward the police line. These officers have a job to do. Most of them are trying to do it honorably. Then he turned back to the protesters. And you have legitimate concerns that deserve to be heard. Turning this into a physical confrontation serves neither purpose. The tension in the square had transformed, not disappeared, but shifted from imminent violence to something more contemplative. Even those most committed to confrontation found themselves listening, if reluctantly, to this unexpected mediator who neither condemned their anger nor dismissed their concerns. Sergeant Alvarez seized the moment, recognizing the opportunity Chuck had created. He stepped forward to stand beside Chuck, removing his riot helmet in a gesture of de-escalation that would have seemed unthinkable minutes earlier. The action required courage. It left him more vulnerable, more human. "We're here to ensure safety, not to suppress speech," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority without the edge of threat. "If everyone maintains a peaceful presence, we can find a better way forward." The synchronicity of their messages, one from official authority, one from respected outsider, created a powerful effect. Other officers, sensing the shift, lowered their shields slightly. Protesters who had been at the front began to step back, creating breathing room between the two groups. But not everyone was receptive to de-escalation. From the middle of the crowd, a masked figure suddenly pushed forward, moving with the desperate energy of someone determined to ignite the conflict that was beginning to subside. In their hand was a makeshift weapon, a heavy chain wrapped around a fist, capable of causing serious injury. Whether aimed at Chuck or Alvarez was unclear, but the intent was unmistakable to shatter this fragile moment of potential peace, to force confrontation rather than conversation. What happened next became the defining image of the night, captured on dozens of cameras and instantly viral across social media platforms. Chuck moved with such fluid precision that it seemed almost choreographed. No wasted motion, no telegraphed intent, no dramatic wind-up. One moment the attacker was charging forward with arm raised to strike. The next they were disarmed and immobilized, Chuck's hands applying precise pressure to key points that rendered the person incapable of further aggression without causing injury. For those close enough to see, the technique was a marvel of efficiency. Chuck had targeted nerve clusters and pressure points rather than striking vulnerable areas, had controlled rather than punished, had neutralized the threat with surgical precision while causing minimal harm. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. The would-be attacker's expression registered shock, then pain, then grudging recognition of superior skill. The chain clattered to the ground, joining Briggs's discarded weapons as artifacts of aggression neutralized by discipline. Chuck immediately released the pressure once the threat was neutralized, helping the stunned attacker regain their balance. He spoke quietly to them, words inaudible to cameras but causing the masked figure to go still, then nod slightly before being led away by other protesters who seemed almost embarrassed by the failed attack. The square fell into complete silence. What they had just witnessed wasn't just physical skill. It was the perfect embodiment of the philosophy Chuck had just articulated. Overwhelming capability exercised with perfect restraint. Power used to protect, not dominate. Theory transformed into practice before their eyes. Even those who had been most eager for confrontation moments earlier now seemed to reconsider. The energy of the entire gathering shifted perceptibly, not to submission or surrender, but to a more thoughtful engagement with the moment, with the possibilities it contained. Ethan, who had pushed to the front during Chuck's address, stared with undisguised admiration. This was what real power looked like, not shouting or destruction or intimidation, but precise, controlled action in service of a larger purpose. The revelation struck him with the force of epiphany that perhaps his understanding of strength had been incomplete, that there were forms of power he had never considered. Sergeant Alvarez stepped forward again, seizing the momentum of the moment. "I propose we establish a dialogue," he said, voice firm but not unyielding. 3 representatives from the protest group, meeting with police leadership tomorrow morning. Real conversation about specific concerns, with commitment to actionable responses. From the crowd, tentative voices rose in agreement. Not universal, but significant. The momentum had shifted not to surrender or acquiescence, but toward engagement rather than confrontation. The possibility of constructive dialogue, which had seemed impossible minutes earlier, now felt within reach. Chuck stepped back. His role complete, he had not taken over. He had simply created space for better choices. The decisiveness of his intervention with the attacker had demonstrated what was possible when skill met restraint, and that lesson resonated beyond the immediate moment, beyond the specific concerns that had brought everyone to the square. Maya Chen approached him as he moved toward the edge of the gathering. "Mr. Norris, what you just did was extraordinary. Would you share your thoughts on what happened tonight?" Chuck paused, considering. Then, with characteristic simplicity, "Real strength isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself." The statement, delivered without pretension or grandstanding, would become the caption beneath countless videos and images of the night's events. A simple truth from a man who had spent a lifetime embodying it, who had transformed entertainment into philosophy, celebrity into substance. As Chuck turned to leave, the crowd parted before him, many bowing their heads slightly or offering quiet words of thanks. Not for taking a side in their conflict, but for showing a different way to engage with it. For demonstrating that force and power were not synonymous, that strength could express itself through restraint rather than dominance. The night that had begun with protest and confrontation was ending with something unexpected, not resolution of the underlying issues, but a demonstration that how we engage with conflict matters as much as what we fight for. The lesson hung in the air, palpable as the lingering tension, but transformative in its potential. Behind him, protesters and police began the tentative process of de-escalation, both sides stepping back from the precipice they had approached. Phones recorded this too, the moment when violence became choice rather than inevitability, when different possibilities opened in the space created by one man's extraordinary discipline, and through it all, Chuck Norris walked away without fanfare. Having demonstrated that sometimes the most decisive strike is the one you choose not to deliver. That true mastery reveals itself not in what you do to others, but in what you choose not to do when you could. Dawn broke over the city, painting the buildings in pale gold light that seemed to wash away the darkness of the previous night. The square that had throbbed with tension hours earlier now lay mostly empty, save for cleanup crews collecting discarded signs and scattered debris. Evidence of conflict remained a few overturned barriers. Graffiti hastily sprayed on walls. The residual energy of confrontation, still lingering in the air, but the violence many had feared had largely been averted. Where hundreds had shouted and surged, now there were only the quiet sounds of mourning. Street sweepers humming methodically. Early commuters passing through with coffee cups clutched in hand. Birds reclaiming their urban territory with tentative songs. Yet something in the atmosphere had changed. As if the events of the night had altered the city's invisible architecture. In police headquarters downtown, the fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across tired faces. Internal affairs investigators, summoned in the early hours, reviewed footage from dozens of sources, body cameras, news videos, social media posts that had already accumulated millions of views. They replayed the sequences again and again. Briggs confronting Chuck, the unjustified tasing, Chuck's impossible endurance, the escalation, the disarming. Each viewing only confirmed what was already evident: a clear case of excessive force, abuse of authority, captured with unprecedented thoroughness. Officer Briggs sat in a conference room, shoulders slumped, head bowed, as superiors discussed his future in hushed, serious tones just outside the door. His badge and weapon had been surrendered upon arrival, placed in a plastic evidence bag that sat conspicuously on the table before him. The reflection of overhead lights on its metal surface seemed to mock him, the symbol of authority he had wielded so carelessly, now stripped of power. 23 separate videos so far, the internal affairs captain was saying to the chief, all showing the same sequence. No ambiguity. The chief nodded grimly. Political pressures already building. Mayor's office called twice before sunrise. They both knew what this meant. In an era where police misconduct had become a focal point of public discourse, Briggs's actions so clearly captured, involving a figure of Chuck Norris's stature, would not be something they could manage through the usual channels of administrative leave and internal review. This would be public, messy, and likely career-ending. Sergeant Alvarez provided his statement for the third time. Precise and unflinching in his account. He sat straight in the uncomfortable chair, fatigue visible only in the slight redness of his eyes, his voice steady despite the hour. Officer Briggs demonstrated a pattern of escalation inconsistent with department policy, he stated for the recorder. His actions endangered civilians and officers alike. I issued multiple direct orders for him to stand down, which he ignored. The internal affairs officer, taking notes, looked up. And in your professional assessment, was there any justification for the initial use of the taser? Alvarez didn't hesitate. None whatsoever. Mr. Norris presented no threat and was not interfering with police operations. And you recognized him immediately? The investigator asked. Yes, Alvarez confirmed. I attempted to alert Officer Briggs, to whom he was confronting, but he either didn't hear or chose to ignore the information. In a nearby office, the department spokesperson drafted careful statements, trying to balance accountability with institutional protection. Early drafts contained phrases like isolated incident and not reflective of departmental values, but even as they appeared on the screen, the PR professional recognized their inadequacy. No amount of careful wording could mitigate what had been so thoroughly documented, so widely shared. Eventually, she settled on directness. The department acknowledges that Officer Briggs's actions fell far below our standards and violated both policy and public trust. He has been relieved of duty pending formal termination proceedings. We extend our sincere apologies to Mr. Norris and to the public we serve. Across town, in a modest hotel room he had chosen precisely because it wasn't where celebrities typically stayed, Chuck Norris performed his morning routine with the same disciplined focus he applied to everything. The events of the previous night had neither accelerated nor disrupted the patterns established over decades: precise movements through familiar kata, meditation in the morning light, then a simple breakfast. His phone, silenced, accumulated hundreds of notifications, interview requests from major networks, statements of gratitude from protest organizers, offers for appearances, messages from old friends who had seen the footage. A text from his agent simply read, "Call me. Now." He ignored them all for now, choosing instead to center himself in the quiet morning hours. Last night had not been about publicity or acclaim. It had been about presence, being in the right place at the moment when his particular skills could make a difference. The aftermath, with its inevitable attention, was secondary to the act itself. As he completed his breakfast, he finally picked up his phone, scrolling through the messages with calm detachment. He paused on one from an unexpected source, Officer Briggs. The message was brief but significant. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Thank you for showing restraint. Chuck read this with particular attention. The humility required for such an acknowledgement suggested that perhaps the most important lesson of the night had landed where it was most needed. He composed a simple reply. Respect is earned through actions, not force. It's never too late to choose a different path. After careful consideration, he responded to one interview request, not from a major network or viral platform, but from Maya Chen, whose professionalism throughout the events had impressed him. Her coverage had been neither sensationalistic nor superficial, maintaining focus on the substance of what had occurred rather than merely its spectacle. Maya Chen sat in an editing booth at her network studio, reviewing footage with producers who had been summoned early to deal with what had quickly become their biggest story of the year. What had begun as routine protest coverage had transformed into something career-defining. Her narration played over the extraordinary sequence of events. Chuck withstanding the Tazer, the confrontation with Briggs, the decisive intervention in the larger conflict. What we witnessed last night transcended the specific issues of the protest. Her voice narrated over the climactic moment when Chuck neutralized the attacker. It became a masterclass in the difference between true authority and mere power, between strength and force. The producers nodded approvingly. This wasn't just local news anymore. This was going national, possibly international. Offers to purchase licensing rights for the footage were already coming in from major networks and online platforms. Have you secured an exclusive follow-up? The senior producer asked, recognizing the potential for even greater impact. Maya checked her phone, surprised to see a notification. Actually, yes. He's agreed to meet this afternoon. The producer leaned forward, excitement breaking through professional reserve. Where? When? We'll need to send a full crew. No, Maya interrupted firmly. Just me, and one camera operator. Those were his terms. The producer looked ready to argue, but thought better of it. The footage they already had was extraordinary enough. Alienating its central figure would be foolish. Fine. But get us something substantial. The whole country is watching. In a downtown apartment, cluttered with textbooks and protest materials, Ethan sat cross-legged on his bed, scrolling through the videos he'd captured. He'd posted some immediately last night, and they'd already accumulated thousands of shares, comments flooding in from people expressing amazement, respect, even reverence for what they had witnessed. But he'd kept one clip private the moment early in the evening when he had mockingly dismissed Chuck as just another passive observer, an older man unwilling to engage. What's the point of being here if you're not going to do something? His recorded voice asked with the casual arrogance of youth. The contrast between his judgment then and his understanding now was stark. He had mistaken Chuck's calm observation for apathy, his restraint for weakness. Like Officer Briggs, he had assumed that real strength announced itself loudly, that effective action required dramatic visibility. After careful consideration, he posted this clip too, with a caption that reflected his transformation. I judged him for watching, instead of shouting. Then I saw what real strength looks like. Lesson learned. The post would eventually reach Chuck himself, who would appreciate the young man's honesty and self-reflection more than any of the adulatory comments flooding other platforms. Growth, after all, began with recognition of one's own limitations, a principle Chuck had embraced throughout his career. At City Hall, hastily arranged meetings between protest organizers and officials began earlier than scheduled. The energy was different from previous encounters, still tense with unresolved grievances, but tempered by the shared experience of the previous night. One organizer opened by acknowledging the de-escalation that had occurred. Last night could have gone very differently, she noted, spreading her hands on the conference table. The fact that we're sitting here talking instead of dealing with arrests and injuries is significant, but it shouldn't take Chuck Norris showing up to make that happen. Officials nodded, recognizing both the truth of her statement and the opportunity it presented. The events of the night had created an unusual opening, a moment when both sides could see beyond entrenched positions to the possibility of actual dialogue. Real progress seemed possible in ways it hadn't before. "You're right," the mayor acknowledged. "So let's make sure something meaningful comes from this moment. What specific changes would create the accountability your community needs?" As they began to work through concrete proposals, the footage from the previous night played silently on a screen in the corner of the room, a reminder of how close they had come to a very different outcome and of the extraordinary intervention that had created this space for conversation. Across social media, the night's events were being analyzed from countless angles. Some focused on police accountability, using Briggs's actions as evidence of systemic issues. Others highlighted the protests' legitimate grievances. Martial arts communities dissected Chuck's techniques with professional appreciation for their efficiency and control. Leadership consultants extracted lessons about authority versus power, about presence versus force. But the most resonant conversations centered on the moment when Chuck had spoken to both sides, calling for restraint while acknowledging legitimate tensions. His words, simple but profound, were being quoted in contexts far beyond the original confrontation. Aggression feeds aggression. Escalation invites escalation. We all have a choice about what energy we contribute to this moment. The phrase spread across platforms, appearing in posts about conflicts far removed from the protest, from international relations to workplace disputes to family disagreements. Something about its straightforward wisdom resonated across contexts, offering a principle that applied at every scale of human interaction. By mid-morning, news vans had located Chuck's hotel. Reporters gathered in the lobby, hoping for a statement or even a glimpse. The hotel manager, protective of his privacy, deflected questions with practiced diplomacy. "Mr. Norris has requested that his privacy be respected," he repeated to each new arrival. "No, I cannot confirm when he might be available for comment." What none of them knew was that Chuck had already left through a service entrance, preferring to continue his day without the distraction of sudden celebrity. He walked the city streets anonymously, baseball cap pulled low, observing the aftermath of the night's events with the same quiet attention he had brought to their unfolding. He paused at a coffee shop where televisions displayed footage from the protest. People sat captivated, watching the now familiar sequences. Some discussed the events animatedly. Others watched in respectful silence. None noticed that the subject of the footage stood among them, ordering a simple black coffee. The barista, distracted by the broadcast, handed him his change without looking up. "Crazy what happened last night, huh?" That cop had no idea who he was messing with. Chuck accepted the coffee with a small smile. "Sometimes we all need reminders about assumptions." The barista nodded absently, attention already returning to the television. Chuck slipped out unrecognized, continuing his solitary walk through the awakening city. As evening approached, Chuck finally accepted one interview request, not from a major network or viral platform, but from Maya Chen, whose professionalism throughout the events had impressed him. They met in a quiet corner of a public park, away from the crowds that still occasionally recognized him despite his attempts at anonymity. "Thank you for speaking with me," Maya began, her cameraman setting up discreetly. "The footage from last night has been viewed millions of times already. People are calling it a defining moment in how we think about conflict resolution and true authority." Chuck nodded slightly, neither accepting nor rejecting the characterization. "What happened last night wasn't about me. It was about choices we all face, whether to escalate or de-escalate, whether to respond to aggression with more aggression or with something different. But your extraordinary skills made those choices possible," Maya noted. Not everyone could have neutralized those threats so effectively. The physical skills were just tools, Chuck replied, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of someone who had spent decades refining both technique and philosophy. What mattered was the mindset behind them. Anyone can choose restraint over escalation, listening over shouting, presence over force. Those choices don't require martial arts training. As their conversation continued, the interview evolved from recounting the previous night's events to exploring deeper themes about conflict, respect, and genuine authority. Chuck spoke not as a celebrity dispensing wisdom, but as someone who had spent a lifetime learning these lessons through experience. When the interview concluded, Maya thanked him with genuine respect. "This will air tonight. I hope we've done justice to your perspective." Chuck nodded appreciatively. The truth rarely needs embellishment. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city that had witnessed such extraordinary events, Chuck made one final stop before leaving. He returned to the square where everything had happened, now largely empty. As the day's renewed protests had moved to City Hall, he stood quietly in the spot where he had faced Officer Briggs, then where he had addressed the crowd at the moment of greatest tension. The space felt different now, marked by what had occurred, but also by what had been prevented. Violence had given way to dialogue, confrontation to engagement. Not because issues had been resolved, but because enough people had chosen a different approach to addressing them. A maintenance worker recognized him as he stood there and approached hesitantly. "Sir, I just wanted to say thank you. My son was one of the protesters last night. The way things were going, I was scared for him. What you did changed everything." Chuck acknowledged this with a respectful nod. "Your son and others like him changed things by choosing to listen when they could have chosen otherwise. That takes its own kind of courage." As darkness fell, Chuck Norris left the square and the city, returning to the quiet life he had built away from spotlights and cameras. He knew the footage would continue to circulate. The story would continue to be told in various ways. Some would emphasize the physical skills he had demonstrated, others the philosophy he had articulated. But the true impact would be measured in smaller, less visible ways, in a young protester who approached conflict differently after what he had witnessed, in a police officer who reconsidered his approach to authority, in countless conversations about the nature of genuine strength versus the illusion of power. The night had created a moment of collective clarity, a vivid demonstration that true mastery isn't about dominating others, but about mastering oneself. That respect cannot be demanded through force but must be earned through actions. That sometimes the most powerful statement is made not through aggression but through its deliberate absence. And perhaps most importantly, that in moments of greatest tension, we all have a choice about what we contribute: escalation or calm, reaction or response, force or presence. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.